Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. Thank you all for coming. We have quite a lot of information, so excuse me, I shall just summarise a few of the key points, if I may, and then the great work of my colleagues is much to absorb. So, look, I think 5 points from my side. First of all, growth. Secondly, volume. Thirdly, Asia. Fourthly, some comments on middle-income countries. And fifthly, some of the work that my colleagues have been doing in the creative economy area. So, let's start with growth. Well, look, this is a consistent story now for at least 8 years. We see that as far as, well, perhaps, excuse me, I should start by saying what I'm talking about, which is worldwide intellectual property activity in the year 2017. So this is not the WIPO systems, which we do every year in about April. This is what's happening in all the patent offices around the world. So now, coming to growth. Patent filings grew by 5.8%. So you see it's consistently above the rate of increase of the world economy. And this is 2017, 3.17 million patent applications. Trademarks grew by 30%, 30, to 9.1 million trademark applications around the world. So that's an extraordinary leap. And Carsten, our chief economist, is of course a very cautious person, much more cautious than I am, and so he may not necessarily approve of this next comment, but trademark applications represent new enterprises and new products. So it's interesting to see the great increase in volume in trademark applications. Designs, well, look, there's about 1 million designs, 945,000 design applications worldwide. It's difficult to give you a growth figure on this because of a change of methodology in the way they're counted in China, which accounts for a very large number of design applications. But let me mention also plant variety applications. We don't often speak about that, but it's new applications, new varieties of plants, and that volume grew by 11.7% in 2017. The numbers are much lower. It's nearly 18,490 plant variety applications, but it's an extremely important area, as a matter of fact, for increasing productivity in agriculture. And this when there are various strains on agriculture, notably populations, increasing population to be fed, challenges arising from climate change for agriculture as well. And I think I'll stop at that point on the growth. Now, volume, we see now that these numbers add up to an extraordinary volume, and I think that underlines the importance that intellectual property now has in the contemporary economy. So, of course, it's driven mainly by innovation, also globalization, but mainly by the policy focus, high policy focus on innovation around the world, and the fact that innovation is increasingly the battleground for economic advantage amongst the leading economies. And intellectual property serves the purpose in all of that of being one of the means by which the competitive advantage conferred by innovation, can be secured. But the volumes are extremely large. And growing all the time. Now, thirdly, Asia, well, it's interesting. It's now roughly 2/3 of all intellectual property applications worldwide. So this is an extraordinary transformation that has occurred in a relatively short period of time. We can give you the exact figures. It's 65.1% of patent applications. It's 66.6% of trademark applications and 67.9% of design applications. So this is, of course, driven mainly, but not exclusively, by China and the extraordinary increases in volume on the part of China. Now, if you look at the number of applications coming out of China or filed in China, more accurately, the numbers are really quite prodigious, and the growth rates continue to be extremely strong. And we can go into more detail, if you like, about that. But an interesting thing is that while the numbers are increasing significantly in China and have been for some years now, the United States remains the most prominent externalizer of its patent applications. So in the US, applicants filed in 2017 231,000 patent applications abroad. Okay, so US applicants filing overseas, 231,000. That's about 4 times as many as the applications filed by Chinese enterprises and nationals abroad. That was about 60,000. So the US remains much lower in numbers than China these days, but a very, very important, the most important externalizer of its production. Just a word about middle-income countries. I think there are some very encouraging figures on middle-income countries, and let me just try to locate them if I can. So as far as trademarks are concerned, among the top 20 offices, you see Iran rising by 88%, China by 55%, Brazil by 12%, 11.9%, Russian Federation by 16.1%. So this is quite interesting. And let me see if there's another one I thought. Have you got another one for me, Masai? In terms of the patents, well, let me pass on that for the rest, and then go on to our last subject, which is that we have started to try to get a better measure of the creative economy. So you will see for the first time that the report includes some statistics on this. And in particular, we have focused initially on the publishing industry worldwide, because this is a very big field and our entry into it will be a gradual one. But the publishing industry worldwide, as yet, we have relatively few countries for which we have data. Nevertheless, it does give us some measure, and we see that China reported the largest net revenue, 202 billion United States dollars, generated by the publishing industry. And the publishing industry covers typically 3 sectors: trade, which is novels and other publications of that nature; educational publishing; and science, technical and medical publishing. So China's performance was followed by the US, about 26 billion, and Germany, 5.8 billion, United Kingdom, 4.7 billion. So these are interesting figures. Digital editions accounted for about 28% of the trade sector in China, which is interesting, 25% in Japan. So there are some preliminary figures, and we've also in this area of trying to provide a better coverage of what's happening in intellectual property and moving beyond mere applications, we've also included some initial results of our commencement of trying to map what's happening in relation to judicial decisions in relation to intellectual property. So, of course, all this volume, one might expect that if there's a certain percentage of applications that results in disputes, then the number of disputes will be rising worldwide. And so we're trying to get a handle on that and to see exactly what is happening in terms of disputes in the field of intellectual property worldwide. It's a complex subject and it's difficult to gather data because we're working with judiciaries and they don't necessarily classify all of the cases that are coming in. But as one anecdotal example, the Supreme Court of the United States has accepted more cases in the field of intellectual property than in any other field in the course of the last 5 years. And that's not just a question of volume, it's also a question of technology pushing our regulatory responses, and so throwing up situations that have not necessarily yet been covered by legislatures in a regulatory framework. So I shall stop at that point, Carsten.
Thank you, Director General. I maybe would just reiterate one point also, since you mentioned it. When we received the data from intellectual property offices around the world, we were quite stunned by the high growth rate in trademark filings this year. It has always been the case that trademarks have grown globally a bit faster than patents, but a 30% figure, is really high. And clearly, China accounts for a lot of that, but it's not just China. We are seeing double-digit growth from the United States, from Japan, 24.2%, and we're also seeing high growth from a number of developed economies: Germany, Brazil, Canada, United Kingdom. Brazil, of course, a middle-income country. And these are quite, I would say, mature markets. So to see that type of growth, I think is quite remarkable. Now, what do we make out of it? I would say two things. One, we know historically trademark filings have correlated with the business cycle, and that is consistent that we are probably in a stage of the business cycle where we see healthy growth. Some people always argued that trademark filings are a lead indicator of the business cycle, and if so, I think that would lead one to be quite optimistic as far as growth prospects go. But a 30% figure, and that's also what the Director General mentioned at the outset, is far above rates of economic growth. One may not be able to directly compare them. But it is a really big number, and I think the other thing we can take away from that it just reflects the importance of brands and the desire and the strategic importance that companies attach to protecting their brands through the trademark system. We know from other work that we have published and that we have discussed here, that branding is an important intangible asset for companies. In some sectors, it is probably the most important form of intangible capital. And as time goes by, that importance only seems to go up. So I think that's the only other point I'd like to add to the Director General remarks.
Thank you. Questions, please.
So, question on the your last point on the creative industries. What exactly is the editorial industry for you? How much do you include book itself, digital book sold by whatever, and why only 11 countries?
We are we are working with the International Association of Publishers Association. So we're taking really as a publication the fairly traditional view of what a publication is and of what a book is. So we are not including within that articles or news items. Sorry, but it's looking really at publications.
And why only 11 countries? So this is a survey that we started last year together with the International Publishers Association. We are now in the second round. And also what we are publishing here is preliminary in a sense that a number of countries have indicated to us that their data are not yet ready for 2017 and they will send it to us. We expect that by the time we have the full data, which will be sometime February, March, we would have close to 35, 40 countries for which we have data. We are very keen, to expand on that and have more countries report to us. But listen, it has taken us a lot of time, to arrive at 130 countries for industrial property and the data you see here. And also we hope by including this now in the World Intellectual Property Indicators that this raises the awareness to the importance of collecting these data. And on our part we'll do our best to expand the data coverage. And also there's still issues about harmonized definition of data, so some data points are not necessarily comparable. So we are still at a relatively early stage, and so we're in that respect cautious, but we would like to expand our statistical collections to the creative economy, and this is a first step.
Just a question, the 11 countries and this volume, what do you think it represents? 80% of the market, 50% of the market?
Well, it's difficult to tell the volume, but I think we capture some of the big ones. So, for example, US is in there, China is there, Japan is there. And if I may just add on something about the 11 countries, if we go to page 209 of the report, you will see you have more than 11 countries. So you have 3 sectors: trade sector, educational, and STM. And for 11 countries, we have data for 3 sectors. But if you look for the trade sector, you find more than 11 countries. So if you go to page 209, you'll find all the data there.
Thanks. Catherine says.
Yes, I have a question about, maybe I didn't read it properly, but I think that in previous years, the last bottom in the filing ranking were mostly African countries. And I thought this year was more like Latin American countries. So did you say that the landscape is changing and African countries are more filing more patents than before?
That's a very interesting observation. I'm going to turn to my colleagues because I would have to study the data to give you a response. But it's a very interesting observation you make.
Moss, can you pull your chair so you can get the microphone?
Yeah, come over, Mo. Pull your chair over.
Thank you.
So if I just want to add on this about the difference between African countries and Latin American countries, we're seeing it's difficult to generalize because it depends on the data. And for the big ones, you look at Brazil, and look at South Africa, they are growing at the similar rate. But for example, in South Africa, this year the growth rate is something, for the patent, for South Africa it was 4.6%. But if you look at Brazil, there's been a decrease of minus 8.4%. So there's fluctuation year on year, but it's difficult to generalize. But general trend will be sort of upward trend for most of their countries, well those 2 countries. Plus you can throw in Mexico, which has seen a sort of volatile growth in 1 year followed by a decrease in the following year. So for this year, there's been a decrease of 1.3% for Mexico. But in terms of share, if you look at the share of the Latin American, Africa, they are kind of a sort of, there isn't much change in terms of volume.
Tom Myers from Reuters, still kind of formulating my question and trying to understand the data, but I'd like to follow up on this leap in the trademarks of 30%. What is driving that? I mean, you said it could be a sign of optimism, but what's behind it? And do you see, well, a separate question, do you see the trend of things continuing this year in 2018? Because obviously the international environment is quite different, or getting interesting. Can you say anything about that in general, not just about trademarks, but across
the board, yeah.
Changing
Okay, so look, I'll have a shot, and then Carsten will, come in and polish it. Starting with trademarks, look, I would say that, as Carsten has already said, brands are an extremely important factor for enterprises. Now, that's always been the case. I mean, there have been brands since the Sumerians, so it's always been the case. But what has changed in the course of the last 20, 30 years is the intensification of globalization or global markets. And, of course, this extraordinary medium, the internet. So being out there with a brand that can be recognized in distributed markets is an extremely important thing for an enterprise operating globally. The distinctiveness of its image and reputation is secured by the trademark. So this is no doubt one, I think, factor in, but it doesn't explain 30%. It explains increasing importance of brands. Now, then I think you have to take into account the prodigious numbers we're getting out of China, which is really, China is, if I'm not mistaken, the growth in trademark applications was about 55%, and China accounts for 46% of the world share of trademarks. So this is another extremely important factor. Now, perhaps let me pause before going to the second so that Carsten can come in.
Well, just to reiterate, essentially a trademark is usually filed at the time either a new company is created or a new product is launched in the marketplace. And I think that's why historically there has been this correlation with the business cycle. Once you have a booming economy, there's more life in the economy, more companies get created, more products and services also is really important in the case of trademarks. Gets launched in the marketplace, so naturally there is increasing demand for trademark protection. But there's certainly not one-to-one correlation in a sense that, trademark usually protects, or one product is protected by more than one trademark. Different aspects of a product's characteristic may be protected. So, it may be a product's name, it may be the shape of a product, it may be a logo that comes with a product. All of these things, are filed separately under the trademark system. And to the extent that, companies in some sense take a stronger strategic view on how their brand portfolio should be protected, they would be, also increasing the number of trademarks they file, for each of the products and services that they offer. And, for some of the really successful brands, you look at the number of brands that protect different smartphone models, and you can just go to one of the big patent offices and look for them, and you would see, in how many ways, they protect, all aspects of their brands through the trademark system. And I think that reflects the importance of, protecting your brand space in the marketplace. And I think there, I would argue that that has become more important over time, and it is really a key strategic asset for companies.
Now, on your second point, we don't have the data, so we're firing in the dark. However, we do have a lot of data about the performance of our international systems, namely the Patent Cooperation Treaty, the Madrid system, and the Hague system for 2018. It's not complete. The year's not over. But what we're seeing there is good growth rates, so a continuation of the trend. Now, of course, it's not a perfect correlation that, increase in the internationalization of applications doesn't necessarily mean that the underlying growth is increasing as well. A good example of that is Japan in recent years, where domestically the number of applications has not increased, but they've internationalized more of them. So we can't say it's necessarily the case, but I would be a little bit surprised if it were not the case, if the underlying activity isn't increasing also worldwide. And that just reflects the increased strategic importance of intellectual property, I think.
Nina.
I just want to answer one more thing. I just had a question. You mentioned Iran, and that was on, was that international patent filings? I was you said 88%, but...
It was on trademarks,
Trademarks, okay.
88%, but in the patent area 4%, so
Okay.
that's significant, and in the design area 12%.
Okay, and so I was wondering, so this is for 2017.
Yeah.
Do you expect, or have you seen a drop-off since the Iran nuclear deal, the U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal?
Yeah, we don't have the data yet.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately we don't have the data.
Sorry, could you say what is going on with Iran? I mean, why is such? I mean,
It's a big question.
But
Yeah.
why such a growth, or why is it such an important player?
Well, I think the Iranian economy has been stimulated. There's a lot of emphasis in Iran. There is a vice president in Iran for innovation, looking after innovation and startups. So I think it's an area that the Iranians are taking very seriously, and we notice that in their engagement in the organisation.
Sorry, but did you see the spike in that after the Iran deal went through?
We don't have that data yet because
historically,
going back. Well, look, we'd have to look at that, but we can look at that. Yeah,
Because I mean, I would assume it
I'd
was
rather
brought
not give
up
an
after
off the
that,
cuff.
right?
Yeah. I think probably, but
Yeah.
we need to verify.
I can pass you on that later on at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, please.
So, journalist of Mississippi TV. So I have a question. There is a conference about the patent protection law. In this case of WIPO. In this case, from it's referred to FIPS. Could you please give us more information about this conference and what kind of new issues will be discussed during this conference?
Look, I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing, but what we have is our Standing Committee on Patents meeting at the moment.
The patent protection conference.
Yeah. So it's a meeting about a Standing Committee on Patents, which meets twice a year, and they have a series of items on the agenda. If I can remember correctly, quality of patents. So this is a very important item, obviously, when you have increasing volumes, to ensure that property rights are only granted over inventions that deserve a property right. So quality is on the agenda. Access to medicines is on the agenda. Transfer of technology is on the agenda. And reasonably technical subject, confidentiality of or attorney-client privilege. So let me just explain that in one word. If you have all this activity worldwide on intellectual property, then a dispute between two companies is likely to occur in a multiplicity of jurisdictions. Classic example being Apple and Samsung, where they litigated in various countries around the world. Now, if what is protected from disclosure because of attorney-client privilege in one country, if the size of the obligation is different in another country, you may, through that channel, get information that you can't get in one other country. So all of these things make it more important to have an even playing field and an even obligation of confidentiality in this instance. So that's what's under discussion there.
John.
Yeah, following up on, you just touched on transfer of technology. what are the WIPO norms on forced technology transfer, which has been an issue between the US and China in the last few months?
No.
How is that dealt in WIPO? And are there any international norms that adequately deal with that, or has to be dealt in bilateral context?
There are no international norms.
So, I'm sorry?
There are no international norms, so indeed the notion of what is forced technology transfer is not even defined internationally. However, there might be trade effects in relation to any such phenomenon, and that is a different matter, of course, from the intellectual property effects, but there are no norms at this stage.
Trade effects. Can you elaborate?
No, well, that's WTO's business, but
Yeah, but even the TRIPS is silent on that.
it is. But there are, arguably, and I'm not taking this point, trade distorting or non-tariff barrier effects. Arguably, but it's not my point. It's not my discipline.
So it would be under other articles of the WTO.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it won't be under TRIPS, I don't think.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much.